Hi everybody. So, in this session we're going to look at the moral philosophy of organisations. We're going to think about the question of why. Why do we have organisations? And what do we think about it? Do we think it's a good thing or a bad thing? Do we think organisations have virtue, or do we think organisations are bad, evil and destructive? Do we think that the world is better because we have organisations in it, or worse? And what we're going to see as we start to unpick that question is we're going to start to see that the concept of leadership emerges as being very important to our understanding of the virtue of organisations. Now, this is a question that many of you probably don't want to ask, probably haven't thought about asking. It's a question that if you look in most textbooks on organisation behaviour, it doesn't get asked. In fact, we've already seen this in our introduction. Most theorists of organisations have tended to accept that organisations do exist. They've just observed that there are organisations in the world, and then they've gone and studied them. They've not actually stopped and asked the moral question, which is, well, should we have organisations in the first place? Irrelevant of whether we study it or not. And this is actually kind of important, right? If you think about most other disciplines, they start not from an observation that something does exist, but that it's a good thing that it exists and we should understand it for some reason. Okay? Medical researchers tend to want to cure a disease, right? They don't just observe that the disease exists and study it in different ways. They do stuff for a purpose. So it's actually, I think it's a really good starting point for you, and it's a way of actually engaging our understanding of business, management, organisation, finance, into wider intellectual discussions. And this is a criticism that often gets levelled at business students, that they're kind of ignorant of the wider philosophical intellectual tradition which they're supposed to have been educated in. So I think it's really cool to sort of start with this, and maybe some of you'll think it's cool and interesting as well. I suspect probably a lot of you won't, but just humour me for a few minutes and I'll do it as best I'll entertain you as best as I can. So, the starting point for this discussion is, should we have organisations? Now, many people answer that question by thinking about, well, what do organisations do? This is a fine place to start. But that's to judge the morality of the things organisations do, not organisations themselves. We want to... I can't turn these notifications off. Sorry. If any of you know how to turn maybe that'll do it. Yeah, where was I? Many people, when they ask this question, think about, well, what do organisations do, and is there something good or bad about what they do? Some people even ask, are particular types of organisations better or worse than others? But we want to go one step further back, and we're going to ask, what about organisations themselves, just as a thing? Are they good or bad? We're going to do that by looking at two perspectives. The first we're going to look at is called collectivism, or we'll call it collectivism, and that's sort of a term for a broad set of ideas and philosophical systems which see organisations as having virtue, as being virtuous or good. We're going to contrast that with a set of philosophical ideas which we're going to call individualism, which tell us the opposite. So, broadly speaking, you can always think of it like a cost-benefit analysis. The collectivist perspective says that the benefits of organising outweigh the costs. The individualist perspective says, no, the costs of organising outweigh the benefits that we get from them. Now, to start off with, let's say, this obviously isn't a philosophy course, so we're going to be looking at some very broad perspectives, and we're going to kind of straw man or straw person. So we're going to kind of caricature them. We're not going to get deep into some philosophical reading. I don't think anybody wants to do that. But we do just want to think about what are the kind of common propositions, what's the common argument put forward in favour of organisations and against organisations. And you'll probably find that there is intuitively one of those perspectives that you kind of just think, that's what I think, that's what I agree with. And what we're going to try to do as the module progresses and as the session progresses is to try to tease out some of the consequences of those propositions and see if you actually then still agree with them. So it's an opportunity for you to reflect on some of your assumptions. And that, to me, is actually kind of the purpose of university, right? It's a space outside of, it's an organisation outside of the real world where you can stop and reflect and think about things. Even in the other disciplines like engineering, things where they're just doing stuff and making things and trying to come up with new discoveries, in a university it's an opportunity to stop and say, what should we be doing? Is this a virtuous thing to do, or is it an evil thing to do? So I think there's some real benefits to you guys and girls. But I appreciate some of you might even just go through the session and think, well, that was like, who cares? I just want to go and make loads of money. Well, that's a philosophical perspective on its own, and I'm not going to criticise you for that. But hopefully, having the opportunity to think about these things, even if you think about them and think, I don't care, well, that's not a waste of time necessarily. So, by the end of this session, you should be able to do 3 things, and I'm just going to read them. You should be able to accurately describe collectivist and individualist moral philosophies of organisations. Once you understand what those philosophies are, what the arguments are, how the arguments connect to each other, then you should be able to develop the skill of critically evaluating each of them. So thinking through, not the philosophies on paper, but how would they work in the real world? What would they mean to you if that was how the world was? And by the end of it, you should hopefully then be able to advocate or to make an argument for one of them. So you should be able to say, here's the one that I believe is true. And as the session progresses, like I say, we're going to see leadership becomes a bit of a theme of these moral philosophies. So we'll then turn to some organisation theory about leadership. So I'll take a quick break and have a coffee, and then we'll start talking about collectivism. Okay, I've had my coffee. So let's start thinking about collectivism. What do we mean? What's this moral philosophy of collectivism? What does it tell us about organisations? How does it explain the value of organisations? Well, the first point to note is collectivism is actually kind of a term that's applied to this set of theories, usually by opponents. It's not usually a term that any person or philosopher within this tradition uses, because collectivism sounds quite negative, like it sort of links into the sort of collectivism of Soviet Russia, which was quite bloody and destructive. It kind of sounds a bit sort of, fascisty or totalitarian. It doesn't sound great, which is probably why opponents tend to use that term. But it's it's probably as good a term as any. But just to point out, if you go and say like, I'm a collectivist, people might think you're a bit weird. But anyway, what's the headline? What's the first paragraph of the Wikipedia page for it? Well, it's pretty simple. Go back to our cost-benefit idea that I talked about earlier on. The collectivist position is that the benefits we accrue, the benefits we get from organising, are more for us as individuals and collectively as groups or societies or organisations. The benefits are more than the costs to us as individuals. So what I want to just quickly go through is some concepts which help set that out. So first off, we're going to think of the idea of the common good. The common good is a term for the benefits that people get from organising. And then we're going to turn specifically to a philosopher, which is Thomas Hobbes, who's an English moral philosopher, sort of founding father of political philosophy as well, who sets out a very persuasive, very influential philosophical justification for organising in his book, which is called Leviathan. A contemporary organisational philosopher called Sverre Spolstra. He says this perspective is actually kind of implicit in almost all organisation theory. So it's kind of the thing which most people that do organisation behaviour agree on, even though they don't necessarily know they agree on it. It's like, it's an assumption, it's a starting point. So let's get to it. The common good. What do we mean? Well, the common good is a concept for things which we share between us as groups of people that benefit us all, that no one in particular controls or owns. So sometimes this is called the commons or the commonwealth. And let's just think of some obvious examples. Like perhaps the classic example of a common good is language. Nobody owns language, but because we have language, we can communicate with each other. Right? We can tell people that we love them, we can tell people we hate them, we can ask people to do things for us, we can get things from people, we can do things for other people. If we didn't have any system of communicating, the world would look very different. But nobody sat down and invented language. Nobody controls language, nobody owns language, right? It is owned collectively or in common. Now the term common actually has a history which we can trace back, and interestingly it's an English history. Obviously it's an English word, so you would expect that. In feudal times, there was what was called common land, and the people that were able to use common land were called commoners, and the common land was tended to be called the commons. And even now, like, you know, if you walk around to parks and places like that, you'll sometimes see them called the common, or, you know, Wimbledon Common, for those of you that know your Wombles. Well, that all refers to this way of organising, right? So just picture yourself in some like medieval, you know, little village, little hut. You had to work for a lord, right? You lived in a subsistence way where you were just like, you needed to get food to eat, you needed to get wood to heat your home, materials, you know, to make clothing from. You needed grass for your cattle to feed on, right, that you could get milk from. And I'm not painting a very great picture, I might sound rubbish, but in feudal times, the way they decided to organise was they would, even though the land was owned by, you know, the landed gentry, the lord would give a small portion of their land to all the people that worked for them, and that was the common land. And the idea was it was not owned by anybody, but it was there as a resource for everybody to use. So there would be woodlands where all of the commoners could go and get firewood. There would be pastures where all of the commoners could take their animals and let them graze. So there was this land that was held in common. None of them owned it, but they could all use it. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about a common good. There are things which we all just kind of need, which we have to work together to achieve. And actually, if you're interested in it, there's various histories of the commons which shows that they were highly organised, had very specific rules, you know, to stop, for example, somebody going and stealing all the firewood and selling it to people. So these were organised spaces with rules, but they were resources that were held in common. Now just think about that. If they didn't have the rules, what would stop the strongest person going and taking all of the wood, right? Or beating people up and letting their animals use all of the grass, right? Nothing would stop them doing that, right? There was no rules. If it was just a question of might is right, you know, the strongest person prevails, or the most devious person prevails, that would be pretty awful, right? Because very quickly there would be lots of people that died because they didn't have any food, they were cold and ill, and you'd get down to just being like this one, this one strong person, right? Who would have everything that they didn't need. So they would no longer be holding it in common, that person would have all of it. What would happen to them? Well, they'd be very unhappy, right? They would very quickly find that they probably got ill from the other people that were getting ill. They might even find that, you know, groups of weaker people got together to get rid of them. Pretty horrible. Well, this starts to lead us into the philosophy that we want to look at today, the work of Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes had a term for this kind of relationship between people. He called it the state of nature. If humans lived in a completely natural state, right, so there was no mediation, no rules, no laws, you know, people just behaved like animals, what would happen? Well, Hobbes' view is that in a state of nature without rules, without laws, without conventions, without beliefs, there would be what he called a war of all against all. Everybody would just be out for themselves. And if I could get something from you, I would take it from you. I didn't care what happened to you. Hobbes says if you think through that kind of a war of all against all, just complete outright competition, survival of the fittest, well, it doesn't sound like it's going to be a very nice place for most people. It would be quite a, destructive, bloody, horrible place to live. Most of us would have very short lives. We would be doomed because most of us aren't the strongest. So we would suffer. Even the strongest would be constantly battling everybody else to prove they were the strongest. Even the strongest would be constantly worried that a stronger person was going to come along. And of course, that's what would happen, right? So, Hobbes says humans very quickly realised, and we're probably different from other kinds of animals in this respect, we very quickly realised as a species that if we escape from the state of nature, if we escape from the war of all against all, there is a common good for us all. If we all agree to some rules, if we all agree to share some things, if we all agree not to kill each other and steal from each other, we all benefit, right? Not just the weakest, but even the strongest benefit. Our lives suddenly become much more fulfilled, much longer, much healthier, much less paranoid. One of the things Hobbes says is that in this state of nature and the war of all against all, when there's always the risk that someone can come and just take your stuff, why would anybody invest in the future? Why would anybody live beyond tomorrow? And of course this is what you see in lots of animal kingdoms, right? They just live on instinct. They don't write plays and record video podcasts for each other. They don't go to university, right? Because there's no point, because they could die tomorrow. Humans do. And Hobbes said that's because as a species, collectively, we kind of all realise that avoiding or getting out of this state of nature benefits everybody. There's a common good to it. So there you go. We get round to the cycle of the common good. So the question then that Hobbes wants to ask is, well, how can we escape the state of nature? How is it that we can avoid this war of all against all? And his answer to that is to organise ourselves. Right? We organise ourselves into groups or societies. And the way we do that in Hobbes' philosophy is by, and we get some kind of complex sounding terms here, we alienate some of our rights. So we take some of the things that we could do in the state of nature where there's no rules, right? We can do what we want. To escape the state of nature, we have to take some of those freedoms or some of those rights and give them away. We have to agree not to do things. We have to start following some rules. So, for Hobbes and for other collectivists, the benefits to us all of escaping this state of nature, of developing some common resources, outweighs the costs. Where's my hands? I can't figure out my camera. Right, the benefits, outweigh the costs. Where's that one? There it is. I want to stop doing that. Outweigh the costs of what we give up, the rights that we give up. And Hobbes says one of the reasons for that is we all give up the same rights. So it's actually very equal. Nobody's worse off, we're all just better off. Right? Because we all alienate the same rights in a society. How do we do that? Hobbes' answer is the best way to organise is around what he calls a Leviathan, or a powerful leader, who we all agree we will follow the rules that they set for us. So we become what he calls a population, a group of people who will follow the rules set by a leader or a Leviathan who's acting on our behalf. And the reason we do that is because protects us, right? We start to have rules. We start to have a group who will follow the rules. And that means we don't have this super competitive war of all against all where we're doomed to live very short lives. So this is about, Hobbes' philosophy is about society as a whole. And it has this very famous picture in Leviathan of this kind of like society feeding up to a Leviathan that stands over them. But the important point to note is it's the Leviathan doesn't impose themselves on the population, they emerge from the population. And so Hobbes says, when this happens, when a leader is elected by the population in any way, democratically, meritocratically, aristocratically, doesn't matter, in any way, they are legitimate. They have legitimate power over them because everybody said that we're all going to listen to this person, because if we all listen to the same person, we will all be better off. So this for Hobbes is the collectivist point of view. Let's just summarise it. If we didn't organise into groups, we would be living in a state of nature where there'd be a war of all against all, which would just be horrible. If we start to organise around a leader that we all agree to alienate some of our freedoms or our rights to, then we escape that war of all against all. We escape the state of nature and we can live healthy, happy lives. Right now, what can we do? Well, now it makes some sense to start investing in our future. Now it starts to make some sense to, create businesses, to build organisations which will outlive us, because all of a sudden we're not living in fear of dying tomorrow. We're not living in fear that if we build something good, somebody bigger than us will come and take it away from us. So this is the essence of the collectivist moral philosophy. And as I said earlier on, for Sverre Spolstra, this idea lies at the heart of organisation theory. If we go back to the definition of organisations that we looked at previously, right, it's the idea that organisations provide some mutual benefit, some common good to a group of people by coordinating their actions, by dividing labour, by setting rules for their interactions. Now, this is exactly Hobbes' philosophy, just instead of talking about the state, it's about organisations. But implicit in it then is this idea that, well, ultimately an organisation has to have some kind of leadership. We're going to return to that in a bit. But this is collectivism, right? We give up some of our freedoms when we get into organisations. Right? We agree to follow some rules. We agree to work in certain ways, to do certain things, to benefit everybody. Seems pretty sensible, right? Well, once I've drank my coffee, which I made earlier on, we'll see the opposite point of view. We're going to look at individualism. So hopefully now you feel like you can accurately appreciate or describe some of the founding principles of collectivism. Just to summarise them: the common good, the state of nature, the war of... I'm going to stop doing that. The war of all against all, the Leviathan and the population, and the idea of alienating rights. Okay, so finished my coffee now, and we're going to talk about individualism. So, in a way, if everything we said about collectivism is kind of the opposite in individualism. So, for the individualist, their judgment of organisations is negative, because they see any benefits that we get from organisations, and there might be some, as outweighing the costs to us as individuals. For individualists, we give up too much. Now that's a very simplistic way of putting this argument forwards, but we'll work through some of these ideas a little bit, and what we'll see is actually the individualist and the collectivists kind of have some points of agreement, which hopefully might be interesting. So the essence of individualism is that instead of there being some common good that we should be all organising ourselves around, is the idea that there is already a high, if not the highest, moral purpose before there's any common good, right? And that is an individual good. For the individualist, the essence of their morality is that the highest moral purpose, the thing which should guide any of our moral judgments is, does it allow individuals to fulfill their needs, their happiness, their desires, their passions, and so on and so forth. And this has a very long history in philosophy, in the same way that collectivism is a term for a very broad set of thinkers, philosophies and ideas. Individualism is also a very broad term for lots of different philosophers, from Aristotle to Nietzsche, but we're going to look at the work of Ayn Rand. And we'll do that for a number of reasons. The main one being that just as Thomas Hobbes is sort of in the background for a lot of organisation theory, Ayn Rand has been incredibly influential among business people. If you just Google, or I don't know what search engines you like using, but if you DuckDuckGo, Ayn Rand, you'll see like Steve Jobs apparently read her books every year and lived by her. Elon Musk says he's read her. There's loads of people in business and in the heads of government and heads of organisations which say that they've read and believe in the thinking of Ayn Rand. Apparently the health minister, current health minister in the UK, Sajid Javid, apparently he every year reads out sections of Ayn Rand's work to his wife until she tells him to stop, which is a bit weird, but just shows you, right? She's been very important. Her ideas have been very important, and they kind of feed into this sort of celebrity, sort of CEO kind of idea. This idea that the thing which should drive our decisions isn't other people, the collective good. It's what we want to do, right? We should have forceful ideas and personalities that we try to make real, right? We try to achieve what we want to achieve. That's the essence of individualism. Okay, so the question then becomes, how does that happen? How is it that people are able to achieve their own happiness? And if that's the highest moral purpose, why don't we do it? Rand sets that out in what was originally called the Individualist Manifesto, but she changed the title to, I think it's called something like How to Make Tomorrow, or The Only Path to Tomorrow. And there Rand takes on the collectivist view. She says that there's a couple of problems, like not little problems, big problems, with the collectivist view. For her, the collectivist view, the idea that we need to elect somebody with power over us to somehow make us happy, is really negative. She said, firstly, you can see how it leads to this. It's got this implicit totalitarianism, or she uses terms like enslavement. And this, for someone like Ayn Rand, for an individualist, the idea of being enslaved, the idea of not being completely free to do what you want, is just the ultimate evil, the ultimate sin. So, for Rand's response to Thomas Hobbes would be, what's going to stop this Leviathan doing what they want to do, right? What's going to stop them starting to enslave and to use the population for their benefit, not the other way around? And she would say, in a rhetoric that you see a lot nowadays on the contemporary right, she said, well, just look at places where they've had this kind of idea. It always leads to powerful leaders who don't end up protecting their populations, but end up enslaving and abusing and ultimately destroying their populations. You could think of like Stalinist Russia perhaps as an example. And that's kind of interesting because Rand came from Soviet Russia, and a lot of her thinking is coloured by that. So a good example, or good illustration I think of Rand's sort of philosophy here, this is the second criticism she has, which is she says, well, if you've got this collective good but everybody's given up their freedom, no one can be themselves, no one can do what they want to do because they're all working towards this collective good. Well, is that really particularly good? Is that a good thing? And she uses this really nice illustration. She says, imagine in like a forest of trees, stunted trees that can't grow where they want to grow, you wouldn't say, well, that was a healthy forest, right? So she said, no, a genuinely moral, genuinely happy society has to be made up of happy individuals. And happy individuals have to be fulfilled. They have to be able to do what they want to do, which means they have to be free to do what they want to do, which means they can't be constrained, they can't alienate their rights. So this is the essence of individualism. The idea in individualism is an organisation of any kind, could be or is immoral because it forces people to alienate their freedoms. And that is like putting, a lid on top of a tree so it can't grow. It doesn't matter what's happening to everyone else around you. If you're stunted, you can't do what you want to do. That is an inherent evil for the individualist. So for individualists, organisations are generally evil things. So Rand's philosophy then starts to work out a little bit more. So firstly, he said, well, why do we have organisations? What does that tell us? And it's here in the text that we're talking about at the moment, where she comes up with this distinction between active and passive people. And this is one of the things that a lot of individualist philosophers end up relying on, is the idea that there are some people that need to be more free than others. There are some people whose freedom, whose ability to achieve their own happiness relies on them using other people. And that there are some people whose own happiness relies on them being used. And you can kind of think, well, that's so different from the collectivist perspective. But it is in the justification for it. So the collectivist perspective is, we want to elect a leader to benefit us all, so we develop a common good that we can all escape from the state of nature. For the individualist, some people might want to be led because that makes them happy. So they're not alienating their rights, they're actually achieving the highest moral purpose. And there are some people who need to lead, and that is the achievement of their moral purpose. And Rand uses the term active and passive people to get at this. Others, like Nietzsche, he talks about Übermensch, or like supermen, super people. So Rand said the problem is that passive people that need to be led, people that are not independent but are dependent on others, if a lot of them get together, then you can create this society of passive people. And this is what Rand thinks happens in collectivism. So she believes that what needs to happen is, in a society, in organisations, they need to be organised around active people. And active people do that themselves by being free to act. They will naturally build organisations. They will naturally build followers. They will naturally find dependent people that want to be led, if you let them leave them free to find them. So we get then some similar concepts in individualism which sort of mirror collectivism. In place of the common good, we now have individual happiness. In place of alienated rights, we have freedom. In place of a Leviathan elected by a population, we have active people who impose their will, Nietzsche calls this their will to power, over passive people who lack that capacity. So what we end up with when we start to work through even the individualist perspective is that you start to still have leaders and organisations, but they're justified in a different way. The justification for it is it's through these organisations, through leaders, that people fulfil their own happiness. So for Rand, what we need is organisations and societies which allow the active people power, allow them to emerge to the top. And here again is where we get a key difference then with someone like Hobbes. For Hobbes, it almost doesn't matter who the Leviathan is. as long as the population accepts them as legitimate and alienates their rights to them, doesn't matter. You could have, a bumbling buffoon, an idiot, in control, but as long as everyone agrees to follow the rules, it's okay. For Rand, that is not acceptable. What we need to have are systems where individuals can rise to power, rise to the top, due to their personal qualities. And this links Rand in then to some other philosophies, things like the work of Machiavelli, who argues that leaders have to have certain cunning skills to get themselves to the top, and then they can do what they want to do. So there you go. That's the individualist philosophy that we're going to look at. Now, again, I will just emphasise there are more individualist philosophies than Ayn Rand. When we could turn to things like anarchism, libertarianism, anarcho-capitalism, and a lot of people position Ayn Rand within them. But for those kinds of groups, any kind of leadership is actually not acceptable. Rand does believe that ultimately, to be individuals, we have to have some leaders and some followers. So it's not the case that she would say all organisations are evil, but she would say only organisations which have been created, or societies which have been created by active people who are free to act, they're the only ones that are moral. So, out of both of those moral philosophies, the first which kind of champions the common good, the second which champions the individual, we end up with a situation where in both cases, we have leadership as a core concept, as a core element of the moral philosophy of organising. So that leads us nicely then to one of the basic ideas in organisation theory, which is leadership. And after I just take a break, I'll talk through some of the key concepts of leadership that have been developed in organisation theory, and we'll try to link them back to the work of Rand and Thomas Hobbes. So we've now looked at collectivism and individualism. So hopefully you are happy that you can accurately describe collectivism and individualism as moral philosophies that justify organisations in different ways. And I'd like you to start thinking through which do you find more intuitively appealing. Lots of people feel like they're drawn to one versus the other. They're often associated with kind of left and right political ideologies, so it might say something about your political leanings. So you can hopefully start to advocate just intuitively for the one that makes sense to you, but also perhaps try to work through some of them. As we started to see when we discussed Ayn Rand's work, the consequence of some of her philosophical positions ends up creating organisations that could look a lot like normal organisations, typical organisations. And there is this constant trade-off at work in both of the philosophies that we've looked at. As Rand points out, for collectivists, how do they stop the Leviathan from enslaving the population? And as we've seen from the individualist perspective, how do you stop active people imposing their will on others or on other active people? These are questions that, when the philosophies hit the real world, become quite complex to deal with. But also what we saw from both perspectives is an emphasis on leadership, right? They're moral philosophies that end up justifying organisations which have leaders. It's outside the scope of this course, but there is a whole literature on leaderless organisations. Sometimes they're called decentered organisations, which we're not going to bother looking at. But if you're interested in, you could do your own research into it. What we are going to do though is then use these moral philosophies that we've covered to think about, well, how does that play into allowing us to understand theories of leadership developed in organisation studies. So we're going to look at two sort of constellations of ideas about leadership, because leadership is, as these moral philosophies would would suggest a basic core foundational concept of most organisations. If organisations have a morality because they're like a Leviathan structure, well, leadership's really important. If organisations have a morality because they allow active people to get to the top, then again they have a focus on leadership. So let's start with the individualist perspective, actually, just because in leadership theory it came kind of first. So early leadership theorists developed what was sometimes called a great man approach, and it is very gendered because they were talking primarily about great men. So the idea here is that leaders, good leaders, have certain physical, psychological, behavioural characteristics. So, research here would say things like a good leader has to be a man, has to be over 6 foot, has to look a certain way, so on and so forth, right? So this is often implicit in people's minds, things like unconscious bias link in here. But it was developed as an idea, not just focusing on physical characteristics, to think about what kinds of traits, what kinds of attitudes, behaviours, ways of thinking do good leaders tend to have. The most prominent organisation theorist here is Stodgill, who in the late 1940s started to investigate leaders and look to see, do they have common traits, common ways of thinking and behaving and communicating. And he found that yes, they do. People that tend to rise to leadership positions tend to, for example, have persistence. They tend to have self-confidence. They tend to have a willingness to accept responsibility, what contemporary leadership gurus called extreme ownership. They tend to be very task-orientated and very focused on getting things done and finished. They tend to be willing to what we call absorb stress, right? They're not scared of confrontation, they're not scared of making enemies, they're not scared of having a go at people. And if you look at lots of accounts of very influential, famous, oh God, I've got really annoying hair in my glasses. Lots of accounts of famous leaders like Steve Jobs, Elon Musk. They're well known for being willing to be really horrible to people working for them because they feel like it gets the best out of them. What this has led to then is some leaders to try to adopt those traits, because the question here is, well, does this mean that leaders have, you're born a great leader, or could you become a great leader if you really work on developing those kinds of traits? We've seen this in recent cases where very high-profile leaders of organisations, when they've wanted to really pump up the value of their organisations, they start to develop certain ways of acting, appearing, even speaking, to try to make themselves take on the traits of strong leaders. Now this clearly links back to the individualist perspective, the idea that there are these active people, right? That they have certain traits, certain needs, certain ways of behaving. They're not scared of insulting or upsetting other people. They're not worried about other people. They're just there to impose their will and their desire for leadership on other people. Sounds kind of good if you've got those traits, and that possibly is why lots of leadership gurus who have those traits tend to agree with the writing of Ayn Rand, the Steve Jobs of the world. However, organisational researchers have actually found out that, well, there's a couple of problems with trait theory. One is it's kind of very gendered, it's got lots of structural biases in place, seems to sort of reproduce structural inequalities in society. Because if people associate people of a certain gender or race or age, whatever, as being leaders because they've been the leaders that they've seen, well, is it because they are the good leaders, or just that's what people have seen, right? So we've got some weaknesses with trait theory. And it's led researchers, just empirically as well, to go and find out, well, actually, a lot of times people don't particularly enjoy that kind of leadership. It's not always that effective. And for every success story, there's, hundreds of failures where people come in and think that they're doing their Steve Jobs impression, wearing, their polo neck and things. And it turns out they're awful. Or where people assume that their leaders must be fantastic because they have certain traits, and they end up engaging in what we would call very unethical behaviours, things like narcissistic behaviour, abusive supervision, toxic leadership. These are all terms that you can look up at your leisure. And we've seen that recently with cases like the CEO of Nissan, who it turned out was embezzling, huge amounts of money from the company, but everyone assumed he must be this great leader. Or Elizabeth Holmes at Theranos. So instead, organisation theorists started to suggest that actually there's different styles of leadership, different ways of leading. There's not one right way. There's not one right way of being a leader, but actually there are different styles that one can adopt. And this starts to lead into the collectivist view, Hobbes' view that actually it doesn't matter how the Leviathan comes to power or how they behave, as long as the population accepts them as legitimate. And this plays out in a number of more recent organisation theories of leadership, which emphasise different styles of leadership can work at different times. So perhaps one of the most famous contributions here was Lewin and Lippitt, who identified different styles of leadership. So they actually observed groups and leaders, I think it was in like a summer camp, with kids and adult leaders. And they found there were some who adopted a very authoritarian way of behaving, of leading. So they would give out orders, they would criticise people that didn't follow their orders, and they expected people to do what they were told. And that, as it turned out, can work in some circumstances. Subsequent organisation researchers have found that authoritarian leadership can work really well in some settings. Then there were democratic leaders who would focus on what the kids wanted to do. They'd explain decisions and they'd try to empower the kids to be involved in decision making. Now again, that probably sounds better than the authoritarian style, but what subsequent researchers have found is that works in some settings, not others. So what you can hopefully start to see is the skill of a leader, in this view, is identifying which setting they're in and picking the appropriate style. Finally, Lewin and Lippitt found that there were some laissez-faire leaders who kind of just wanted to leave the followers to do what they wanted to do. They would, in their example, only give advice or intervene when they were directly asked, when the followers couldn't figure things out for themselves. They wouldn't praise people, they wouldn't blame people, they'd just sort of be off away. And that can actually work really well. You will find lots of examples of good leaders who are good because they leave their followers to do the work as best they can. Now, the key point in leadership styles, it's so important to emphasise it, is that it's not the case that one of these is better and the rest are rubbish. Rather, it's all about trying to adopt the right style for the situation. And this is the starting point of what's called the contingency approach to leadership. So leadership researchers started to look at traits, then they thought, well, is it the case that you have to all have one trait? And they said, no, there's different styles of leadership. And then contingency theorists said, the style of leadership is contingent on the situation. So good leaders have situational awareness. They are able to understand what's going on and pick the appropriate style. So, what that then starts to do, I'm starting to get hungry, my tummy's rumbling, it starts to put an emphasis on the situation. So now we start to say, well, if leadership depends on the context, what's in the context? And one of the big things in the context is followers. And this is developed into the concept of followership or leader-member exchange theory, which emphasises good leaders cannot be understood just by looking at the leaders, but you also have to think about the situation and the followers. What do the followers want? And hopefully, it's not a stretch for you to start to see how this really starts to feed into or draw upon the moral philosophy of collectivism. That it's the population, Hobbes said, that elect the leader. Or subsequent leadership theorists have said good leaders are ones who appreciate the needs of their followers and do something for their followers. It's not about what the followers do for the leaders, it's about what the leaders do for the followers. How do they create this common good that allows the followers, the organisation, to function effectively? So this is a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some concepts in leadership theory. We've got trait theory or great man theory, leadership styles, contingency theory. I talked about situational leadership or situational awareness, and then followership and leader-member exchange theory. And I'm going to leave those for you to look into a little bit in your own time. But hopefully you can see how they feed into, or draw on, some of the moral philosophies that we've talked about. So what you can hopefully start to see is how if you believe in individualism and Ayn Rand, well then starts to mean you've got to believe in trait theory. So what happens if you're not that kind of leader? Do you really then believe in the philosophy? Does that mean you're going to accept yourself as being a passive follower? If you believe in the Hobbesian notion of the common good, you kind of have to support the contingency theory approach, which means you have to place more emphasis on the followers than the leaders. So hopefully you can start to work some of those consequences out, and that'll help you critically analyse some of the realities of the moral philosophies in the real world. So, just to summarise, and I'll go back to our learning objectives. Oh man, it's rumbling. So, the first learning objective of the course was to accurately describe I'll start again. The first learning objective of this section of the course was that these videos should help you to be able to accurately describe collectivist and individualist moral philosophies. So now I've given you an introduction to both of them, which hopefully has helped you to understand some of the key premises and propositions within each philosophy. You should be able to critically evaluate the implications of both. And one of the key ones that we've teased out is leadership, and that both perspectives end up emphasising the role of leaders as being the good thing about organisations, as being the moral underpinning of organisations, the Leviathan or the active man. And then we turn to leadership theory to start working through some of those implications in the real world to help you begin to critically evaluate those implications. And if you put those together and develop them, hopefully you'll be able to start advocating for one theory over another. You'll be able to say, this is the moral philosophy that I believe in, this is why I think organisations are good. And I think that stands you in good stead as students of organisations to start making decisions about what kind of a person, leader, follower do you want to be. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully you feel like you've met those learning objectives, and I look forward to recording some more videos soon.